Hey folks, thanks for listening. We're going to be talking about some pretty heavy topics today. Suicide, self-harm, emotional distress. If any of these topics are triggering or bring up any difficult emotions, please take a look at the links to supports in our bio and on our website.
It's a Minefield is a weekly audio program where we talk getting the most out of life with mental health challenges, with fun and love, to be enjoyed by the whole community.
On It's a Minefield, we speak with well-known and not so well-known Australians about the issues that affect us as we live with these challenges.
It's the mad leading the mad.
We're pretty in sync with each other.
Religion, spirituality and psychiatry share a long and complex history. Western medicine originated in an era when illness was seen as the result of being disrespectful to God. Therefore, healing required support from the divine, and priests had a unique role as healers. During the Middle Ages, the first hospitals developed in monasteries, and nuns served as nurses. Today, many religions and their belief systems influence people's mental well-being, as well as providing social services like St. Vincent's or the Salvos. For some, religion has had a damaging impact on mental health. For others, religion has given life meaning and instilled hope. Our next guest knows a lot about religion. Carole Cusack is the Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Sydney. Her research interests include medieval European religion, religious conversion, paganism, and the relationship between religion, politics, and pop culture. She also has a very keen interest in new religious movements, alternative spiritualities, and invented religions like Jediism and the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Carole, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Leon.
Firstly, you've dedicated your life to religious studies. Where did your interest in religion come from?
I was brought up in a religious family. My parents were Catholics, and it had considerable influence, I think, on the way I was until I went to university at 18 and became independent. And I spent most of my 20s moving away from religion. And by the time I got to be 30, I was very definitely atheistic. But I think one of the reasons that happened was partly because I did study religion at the university.
Right.
I'd initially wanted to study history, but I came into religious studies because it enabled me to do historical research, but bring in other sorts of factors. History was quite narrowly conceived in 1981 when I went to university.
I was also raised in a Catholic family. Would you identify as being a recovering Catholic?
No, actually I wouldn't.
Right.
And that's a very interesting question because a lot of my friends, I think, feel, and in lots of cases it's not just feel, they know that they were harmed by the Catholic Church. I don't have that experience, didn't have that experience, and I feel obviously fortunate that it was something that was not part of my development as a child or a young adult. But it's interesting to consider, which I think is something that a lot of recovering Catholics don't, that many, many people who've been brought up in religious backgrounds and with different traditions have similarly been harmed or at least distressed by the religion that they grew up with.
Yeah, in what ways can religion have a negative impact on people's mental well-being?
Well, I was thinking about this when you proposed that I come on your program, which I was very glad and grateful to do. The most important thing, I think, is that religion is associated with a number of disorders that include certain kinds of obsessive-compulsive behaviour, also sort of ruminative disorders where a person's thoughts run on a treadmill, little hamster wheel in their mind, and particularly around questions of guilt. So religions that are very strongly motivated towards salvation, like Christianity, often create highly insecure adults who don't feel, actually insecure adolescents as well, who don't feel that they know that they're going to be saved. And so they worry constantly about hell, eternal punishment, not making the grade with God. And this, of course, when you put all of those things together, creates anxiety.
Yeah. For some people, their choice of the way they choose to behave or their ethical practice can be derived from either a fear of hell or a desire to go to heaven, as opposed to other ethical decisions people make, such as human connectedness, well-being, fairness and things like that.
Absolutely. Well, that's just an interesting thing because, you know, as well as being a researcher, I teach.
Yep.
And one of the things that everybody who teaches knows is that people can be motivated by what are called extrinsic motivations or intrinsic motivations.
Yes.
And if you're talking about learning, everybody says, you know, there's no doubt, it's like hands down victory.
Yep.
To be intrinsically motivated makes it much more likely that you'll learn, you'll be successful in your learning, and also that it'll be pleasurable.
Yes.
So the problem with that kind of idea of being good because you don't want to go to hell or because you want to go to heaven is that it actually often ends up being really joyless.
So learning or motivation doesn't come from something that you enjoy doing or something that is, as you say, internally derived, but by rules and obedience.
That's right.
So interesting. How has mental illness been historically interpreted and treated by religions?
Well, this is one of those complicated questions. The problem is that there are two sides for everything. And there's a lot of research, for example, to point out that at certain points in life, particularly older adults, religion correlates strongly with lower levels of depression, anxiety and suicide, and higher levels of well-being, enjoyment of life, and so on.
Right.
It's interesting because mostly that seems to connect not so much with what kind of religion you believe, like it's equally true for Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Buddhists.
Yep.
It's more about being integrated into a community and feeling support and the friendship and companionship of like-minded people, which for a lot of aging adults is a difficult thing because they may lose their partners or their old friends. And so having a frame, a community that they can slot into, and particularly in the case, say, of supported accommodation, which is run by particular religious groups, and the people who therefore come to live in that place have an expectation of, you know, kosher food if you're Jewish and mass every week if you're Catholic and those kinds of things. And so there's a sense of familiarity and security around a religious frame late in life.
Yep. So there's something of the shared values, but really importantly, the connectedness that religious practices provide that can increase happiness, meaning, well-being in older populations.
Definitely. But of course, lots of religions have kind of strange explanations for mental health.
Yeah.
And these sorts of things exist still in the 21st century, which may be quite surprising, I think, to some of your listeners. But, you know, the idea that mental illness is the result of demonic possession, that it's the result of sin. Indeed, that works for physical illness too, you know, the idea that you're being punished for your sins or your disobedience towards God.
Yes, absolutely.
That is a really horrible kind of interpretation. And of course, there are other groups, particularly very fringe, healing-oriented churches, which are, you know, sometimes Pentecostal, but sometimes only tangentially related to that sort of broader mainstream, but stand alone, that often demand of their members that they give up taking psychiatric medicines and various things like that. And of course, the Church of Scientology is famously hostile to psychiatry and psychiatric medication. So there's a real tension in that sort of religious milieu if somebody does have a mental illness.
Absolutely. And without going into details, there's a lot written about the life of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, and his relationship with psychiatry and medication, which seems to have made him very angry.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly when his second wife was divorcing him, and this is a little complicated because actually I don't think he was legally married to the second wife.
I don't think so either.
Because he was still married to his first wife
Yep.
when they went through a wedding ceremony. But she claimed in the custody hearing for their daughter, Alexis, the second wife, who was known as Betty, she claimed that he was paranoid, schizophrenic. But the interesting thing about these things is that there's no formal diagnosis.
Yeah.
So we can't actually say anything about that definitely.
It's a very interesting case, sort of diagnosing from history. What I'm interested in is, and we kind of touched on it, is what you've described as invented religions like Jediism and the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Why were they invented?
Okay, this is an interesting question too. Lots of people are made uncomfortable by the idea that religions are invented. But if you think about it really carefully, and you take a naturalistic standpoint, like I work for a secular university, I'm not a theologian, I'm not involved in any kind of confessional discourse. If you take a kind of secular viewpoint on religion, all religions are basically human cultural products.
Yes.
Humans develop them. They develop the rituals, the forms of service, they write the hymns, they make the artworks, they build the churches, the temples, the synagogues, So human creativity and human desire to create culture goes hand in hand with religious impulses. And the religions that I call invented religions began to appear in the 50s.
Yep.
And so this is a period after World War II. There's been several sort of landslide pullings away from conventional or organised religion, largely because of things like World War I and World War II, which caused enormous disillusionment and distress for huge numbers of people. And so when you get to the 50s, a lot of people think the 1960s is the era of really exciting new religions appearing on every corner of the street.
Yeah.
But actually the 50s is like an incubator.
Right.
And there's the beats who have become interested in Buddhism, particularly Zen. There are a couple of UFO religions that are founded in the 50s. Scientology is founded in 1954. And my invented religions, well, Discordianism is founded in 1957. And the people who founded these religions were mostly, disproportionately, regularly, young, male, highly intelligent, often quite well educated, interested in literature, art, music, but also very, very free thinking in ideas around morals, social organisation, etc. And they found the kind of religion that was available was totally spiritually unsatisfying to them. It just didn't speak to them at all. It was hidebound, conventional, dull, and they wanted to find religion that was authentic and reflected the world as they understood it. In some cases, that meant that they explicitly went and made up religions, like Kerry Thornley and Greg Hill, who founded Discordianism with some friends in 1957 in California. But sometimes they used a script that was pre-existing. So the Church of All Worlds in 1962, in April 1962, was founded by Tim Zell and Lance Christie, who were friends at a college together. They were in Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri, studying psychology together. And they used Robert A. Heinlein's book, Stranger in a Strange Land, as their kind of Bible to found a new religion.
Yeah. How did that go?
Well, it's really strong and healthy and still going.
Wow.
Lance Christie died in 2010, but Tim Zell, who's now called Oberon Zell Ravenheart, is still alive and going well as a great pagan elder, and the Church of All Worlds is all over the Anglophone world and also in some non-Anglophone countries, including Germany and the Netherlands.
Yeah, it made it international.
Yeah, totally.
How can the lives of people living with mental illness be enhanced by faith or religion?
The primary role of religion, it seems, if you look at it functionally rather than in terms of its context or what the doctrines are or whether people think it's true or not, what religion does is create identity, and this is individual and communal. And so if you have a strong faith and you belong to a community, you tend to be supported and to have like a reference group and people to share your griefs and your problems with.
Yeah.
And it also strengthens your individual identity.
Yeah.
So that is like the optimal thing. If you're religious and you belong to a supportive religious community, and their doctrine, their teachings actually help you integrate your medical treatment with your spiritual development, you'll be better. I mean, this is a really interesting thing. A lot of counsellors, even ones who do identify as religious, often say that there's a big difficulty trying to discern something that's a psychiatric or psychological state from something that's like a spiritual crisis.
Yes.
And since COVID, there's been an astonishing kind of mushrooming of literature in academic journals around what the spiritual crisis means. Because loads of people who aren't religious at all have nevertheless been having spiritual crises in discovering that their world has changed so much by the appearance of this pandemic.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. And just to disclose a little bit about my story, my diagnosis, I call it, is bipolar. And what others call my first manic episode, at the time I called a spiritual awakening. Today I call it a very interesting, unusual experience. The jury's out. Do other people have those sorts of interpretations?
Yes, very much so. And the other thing I think that's fascinating in terms of COVID is that it's also a lot of the people looking at ways to work through the isolation and the knowledge of vulnerability that is causing this crisis in so many people is a massive rise in, for example, advocacy of psychedelics use.
Yes.
And also of other mind-altering techniques rather than substances, including mindfulness meditation and various other kinds of what used to be kind of formally understood as spiritual disciplines, but which are now kind of just taught in a secular context as like coping techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the teachings of the Buddha about desire and things like that, the basic trials and tribulations of life, are not too dissimilar from CBT or mindfulness. Mindfulness today is derived from those sorts of practices.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting, I think, that everybody now has the option of viewing things like mindfulness meditation as either a spiritual practice, if they want to define themselves as spiritual, and this connects with this idea about people who are spiritual but not religious. But you also have the option, if you like, of treating them like yoga as just a technique, something to help you cope. Whereas yoga can be either a deep spiritual practice, and it may be indicative of membership of a particular neo-Hindu group, or if you are of Indian background, of older forms of Hinduism, but it could also be just pursued for wellness and for integration and for health.
And for stretching.
Yeah, true.
Look, just lastly, there are times in my life that I've found the darkness intolerable, and like me, I believe you describe yourself as an atheist. Where do you derive hope from?
You know, that's a very important question. I don't know if I am typical. I think I'm a particular type of person, and so I suppose there is a category of people who are like me. My partner of 24 years died in February.
Right.
I have difficulty in terms of my own health, but I've always been one of those kind of capable pragmatist type people, and I have felt terrible grief, and I have cried, and I still do, and I find memories sometimes comforting and sometimes awful, but I have never in my life in any experience. I mean, the death of my beloved father 17 years ago also affected me. The breakup of my marriage when I was only 29 years old and was very optimistic and had really found it a terrible, terrible shock. I never once thought I wouldn't get through it. I never once thought that there wasn't a reason to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Wow.
And I think I'm really, really fortunate in that. I don't think I particularly was taught resilience in any real way, though I suppose in some ways you might have said that my parents were oriented towards having capable, kind of practical kids. My dad was a tradesman. My mother had left school at 15, and they definitely didn't expect to have a professor of religious studies as a daughter. That was not part of the world that they lived in. And I mean, my dad taught. He had 3 daughters before my brother came along, so we all learned how to weld and paint creosote onto fence posts. And I remember once being given a sledgehammer on a 3-foot handle and told to knock down a brick front fence.
Did you do a good job?
I had enormous fun. So maybe it was my upbringing that kind of created that sort of practical orientation. But I'd feel the darkness, but I never let it in.
Feeling the darkness and never letting it in. That sounds like a perfect time to thank you so much for your time and your expertise, and you are very, very interesting. Your interesting stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leon.
Hey everyone, I'm Caroline Savransky and welcome to Club Mind, the part of the show where we get 3 people with lived mental health experience to reflect on the interview you all just heard with Carole Cusack on religion and spirituality. And isn't religion and spirituality a damn doozy of a topic? Probably one of the most polarizing topics in the world. And I can't promise to tread lightly because this program is a safe space to delve into difficult topics, think critically, and welcome all kinds of views. So today I welcome Shifra, Elizabeth, and Jewel. Thanks so much for joining us today on It's a Minefield.
Thanks, Carol, for having us. Thank you. I'll introduce myself. I'm Shifra. I'm 30 from Sydney. I grew up as culturally Jewish, and my father's background is Serbian Orthodox.
So I'm Jewel. I became a Christian when I was 8 years old and had 20 years as an adult after being very dedicated to God, where I walked away from God, and then I came back probably about 10 years ago.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I don't know what to call myself in a sense that I attend Mass online as a Catholic, but there is so much in the Catholic Church that I am totally opposed. So I don't know I'm a Protestant Catholic, but my spirituality and my connection, my relationship with God, which is all that matters. So to me, all of the stupid things that happen in the Catholic Church are not, I'm ashamed of them, but they're not highly relevant because it's all about my relationship with God, and I learned that through Catholic processes.
What do you all think about the old school views where religious beliefs played the main role in how we view and treat mental illness?
This is Jewel. Historically, definitely it did, in that mental illness was considered demon possession and things like that. So when I first worked with people who have schizophrenia, it was just very bizarre to me seeing them walk along having conversations with people that I couldn't see. And I know that mental illness is a chemical imbalance in the brain, but I have also seen spiritual healings of it. And to me, I don't say this at work, of course. I don't talk about the spiritual cause, but to me, there can be a spiritual cause because I've seen people heal from that.
We don't know that mental illness is just a chemical imbalance in the brain. That's a convenient explanation that some people use because they don't want to acknowledge that we don't know what causes any mental illness. We don't call any mental illness.
Yeah,
remember,
I agree.
Epilepsy used to be in mental illness. Schizophrenia may well be found to be a particular condition in the brain, but the notion that it's all a chemical imbalance in the brain, as my understanding is partly that there's different things for different types of mental illness, I suffer from bipolar, and they just don't know, but they suspect that it's partly genetic, partly nearly all depression. They just sort of have a component of environmental disturbance. You know, it's certainly not just a chemical imbalance in the brain. That was what politicians years ago used so that he didn't have to face any problems in his life.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In terms of the question, it was, the time when religion was very closely related to the state and had incredible power over the people and keep people, guided and on the right path. And for many people that had a strong part in their life and helped guide them in terms of morality and ethics and stuff like that. But I think for me, it's a very personal relationship. I've had delusions and hallucinations that have been very strange to come out of, where I have, been a messiah and a prophet, and I didn't know how to kind of make sense of it, and had a lot of shame and very mixed feelings about processing those experiences. But now looking back, I do have a very creative mind, and I have a creative side of me that needs to be fulfilled and nurtured and fed. I can't kind of shut that off, as well as my spiritual side that I think needs feeding as well. So that kind of needs to be in balance. So I guess for me, spirituality comes into like being a good person. Am I like being a good friend? Am I living by the morals and the values that I hold? That's what it means to me. In terms of the religion, like you look at shamanism and how like it's interpreted in the Western, in Eastern philosophies, and these people with schizophrenia in Australia are revered and are looked at with great respect, and as people with wisdom to pass down. So there's a huge culture gap in terms of people with lived experience and what they can bring to society and what they can share. So, yeah, we come from very different places.
I often think to myself that we're in the wrong country when about what you said about the shamanism. Like in Africa, all this is fairly normal, and like you said, people are revered for having experiences like that.
So would Jesus, so would Moses, so was the Prophet Muhammad. Like he talked to God for months in a cave and wrote down the Quran. His wife, like he was talking to no one.
I think that there's all of these people, all be suffering from schizophrenia because they're talking to no one. But in fact, they're talking to their mobile phones.
Oh, well, that's a different story.
No, but that's the bizarre society we live in, where years ago you would have gone, oh, that poor person, they're hearing voices and they're talking to them. And now I go, oh, there's another schizophrenia person. I think they're talking to a phone.
Yeah, that struck me. It's funny at times too, because I've thought myself, because I like to walk around and pray, and whenever someone came near, I would stop praying, and now I can just keep praying because people think I'm on the phone. But yeah, it is strange. When I first saw all these people talking, I had the same thought, like, oh, that's a bit strange. Who are they talking to? No one.
So just put some headphones on and you're fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now they have the things in the ear. But anyway, we got off track. For me, spirituality, it used to be that I was brought up in the Catholic Church, and all over the place, if you can find people who are involved in social justice, they've got some sort of religious background. I speak of Angela Merkel in Germany, all sorts of people who have a social justice background from a religious upbringing. Now, I was brought up very much to think of the other person and give to the other person. I've now become much more aware that that's part of my life, but God is also with me when I'm extremely mad and angry and screaming, because that's part of my condition. And also God has definitely been with me when I have been trying to commit suicide. God is with me all the time.
Elizabeth, that's a really good point of suicide, which I was really curious about, because I actually asked my parents this previous to starting the podcast, because in the Orthodox tradition, in the Serbian Orthodox, they will not bury you if you have died by suicide at all.
Really?
At all. And it used to be in Judaism too, but they've come a long way, because now they realise that they look at as, coming from a mental health condition, and they're seen as suffering from a mental health condition, and that's what causes suicide.
And they're sorry that they've contributed to the person having mental illness, I hope.
Yes, exactly, and they can be buried in the same way and go through the same grieving process, and they can be buried even in the ultra-Orthodox sects, which my uncle is a part of, my family's a part of, can be buried in the ultra-Orthodox way. So I was very delighted to hear that, actually, because I was very surprised to hear that in the Jewish faith they can be. But it's a very sad thing to hear that someone could spend and devote their life and then turned away to have their legacy not be able to be buried with their people and their community.
Yeah, I know that back in 2003, the annual Suicide Prevention Australia National Conference, which was held in Brisbane, had as its theme, Finding Meaning to Sustain Life, the place of spirituality and suicide prevention. Now, I picked this topic, because I was very affronted and annoyed that felt to me as a notion that if you believe enough in God, you won't be suicidal. And I totally oppose that. I say, no, you can have a very strong connection with God and still be very suicidal for all sorts of reasons. And God is with me, God is suffering with me when I'm very, very depressed or suicidal.
Sure. This is Jewel. I'd like to agree. My experience is, as someone who's tried suicide many times, because I couldn't bear the emotional pain anymore. And the thing that kept me from killing myself was fear that I may go to hell.
Yes.
But also the thing that gave me the courage to do it was the hope that I may go to heaven.
Yeah.
So it pretty much played a life and death role in my major depression.
I share that very, very much. I keep saying, well, I can't be sure this is going to work out. So that's one of the main preventatives for me. The other one is I'm just scared that there'd be a God squad who think, and I've come across them, if only you believed in God enough, you wouldn't go to this point of suicide. You know, God would sustain you in life. And I just say, you don't understand suicide, and you don't understand the relationship with God, and God who understands suffering, God who gives us free choice. God may say, I would prefer you didn't commit suicide. That's your choice. So I do understand totally. It's a preventative for me also.
Yeah, and on that point, Elizabeth, that there is free choice, and you know there is this campaign towards zero suicide, and I have an issue with that language towards zero suicide, because of course you want every measure to be in place and every support to be in place for people to not have that as their only option, but ultimately it is that person's choice. Of course you want every option to be there and to exist, and for them to have hope and to have something.
Yeah, I've had people friends have committed suicide, and I've been overjoyed at their funerals, that they're released from this life, from suffering. So I respect suicide a lot, and also the whole notion that there's all this prevention, and if only you speak up, you're going to be cured, and there's going to be prevention. The prevention of sitting in psych hospitals and going through, for example, umpteen different psychiatric drugs, which I've done in the last 30 years, and the mess it makes of your body is a fool's paradise about the alternative.
We're gonna have to start wrapping up. You guys have been amazing. I've barely had to ask any questions, but we're just got to get back on track just for maybe one or two more questions. So you spoke a lot about how the belief in God and wanting to go to heaven helped you, not suicide. Are you grateful for that?
I wasn't grateful at the time, because suicide was my solution, and I had no hope that anything could ever get better, and the emotional pain of life was just too much for me. But I never thought I would say this back then, but I am glad now that I didn't kill myself, that I'm living here on earth to serve a purpose.
Good luck to you. Very good luck to you.
Thank you.
I have a pretty low commitment to life, and am I glad that God, the unknown after death, and how would God receive me, played a part. Am I glad of that? No. Well, no. I just haven't got a great commitment to this life, and anybody that knows me just knows. And doctors have a lot of trouble with it.
I just quickly wanted to add that when I said purpose, I realised like in the Bible it says we're to love God with everything we have and we're to love our neighbour as ourselves. And so I realised my purpose is to show love to people.
And yourself.
Yeah.
Many years ago, I picked up that I hadn't learned and loved myself. And so that's been a whole challenge.
Carole said the primary role of religion is to create individual and community identity, which she said is the optimal way of integrating your faith with your medical treatment, almost like the perfect recipe for starting to feel better or in mental health treatment. Do any of you feel that way?
I do agree with that. I mean, I've seen it go both ways. I work with people who have very strong religious beliefs, and it's been part of their condition and very fixed and very deep-seated in their delusions that there's nowhere to go with it, but you have to work with it, and that's fine. It's not causing anyone harm, but it can be a really strong protective factor for some people, but it can also mean that it can be a barrier to expanding people's social circles because they can be very much focused on I have to have a certain type of friend or I have to have a certain type of social group. I can't be friends with people who are outside of that. For me, it doesn't really affect me because I personally, I'm spiritual and I don't really adhere to any one religion, and I will talk to anyone about religion and I'm happy to. But yeah, I have seen it sort of limit people in terms of the connections they make. And I've also seen it can also kind of feed the psychotic symptoms they might be experiencing as well.
True.
Thank you so much, Shifra, Elizabeth and Jewel, for joining us. Religion and spirituality is a really intense topic, so we're so grateful to have had you guys be open and honest and give your opinions on the matter. The interview Club Mind just reflected on was Leon Fernandez interviewing Carole Cusack, who is a professor of religious studies at the University of Sydney, on the topic of how religion ties in with mental health. Thank you for tuning in.
Hi folks, it's Chris Jager here, bringing you another episode of Out of the Box. Today we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex and asexual inclusivity in sport. My guest is James Lolicato, a Melbourne man who is changing the sporting landscape and making it more inclusive and safe for LGBTQIA+ people. As a sport-loving teenager, James came out as gay in high school and found being one of the only openly gay students in PE class to be a turbulent experience that took a toll on his mental health. These struggles inspired James to establish Pride Cup, an organisation that exists to challenge LGBTQIA+ discrimination within sporting clubs at all levels and make them welcoming and supportive environments for LGBTQIA+ participants and fans. James is the CEO of Pride Cup and joins us now to talk about his own journey and LGBTQIA+ inclusion. James, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To start off, I know I was reading a Vic Health survey on inclusion in sport finds that LGBTQIA+ sports players feel like they need to be in the closet in order to play sports. Why do you think this is?
It's a great question, and we see that around... The really hard stats to hear is in 2015, around 80% of LGBT people were still in the closet partially or completely in a sporting community. In 2021, that's still at around 82 or up to 85% of people. So we actually haven't seen much of a change happen over the past almost 6 years.
Yeah, there's some really high statistics there.
Yeah, and what it shows is that the culture that's created around sport and sporting communities isn't always the most inclusive or accepting of the LGBTI community. So instead of coming out and being open about who they are and bringing their whole self to the field, people are being completely or partially staying in the closet because they feel that that's the more safe alternative to being in those sporting communities.
Yeah, and I guess what are the dangers of people staying in the closet for their own mental health? Yeah,
great question again. It's really around the mental health side effects that kind of come around with being in the closet. So what we know is that LGBTI people who stay in the closet and really can't bring their whole selves to the sporting community. One, they're always thinking about something else when they're on the sporting field. So they're not bringing their whole self, their whole ability into that sporting community. So that's that first step of that kind of those physical benefits that they're losing out on. But then you've also got the mental health negatives that come out of that as well, because when you're trying to hide a bit about who you are, when you're not feeling safe or included in a sporting community, you're at higher levels of anxiety. You've got high levels of depression as well within the community who are staying in the closet. You also have high levels of smoking, high levels of alcohol abuse as well. And it's all surrounded around having to hide who you actually are from the people around you and always having to put on a face or a persona that isn't actually true.
And I guess, like, as a teenager who loves sport and also, you know, you came out as gay during high school, what discrimination did you face in high school and in PE class and in the sports that you played?
Look, overall, high school was fairly accepting environment for me. I remember most of my classes were really accepting and inclusive. I didn't really hear any homophobic comments. Look, there was nobody else really like me in the school, so I definitely stood out a little bit. But the schooling community was fairly accepting, fairly inclusive. Yes, they all had a way to grow and to learn, and I did get asked a lot of questions, but overall it was okay. The only place that I really faced severe discrimination, and I would say severe discrimination, was sport and PE class.
Yeah.
And I really put it down to, again, the culture and the environment that sport has, where the usage of homophobic language and homophobic behaviour is almost part of the game. So I remember hearing kind of derogatory words and comments and homophobic comments so often throughout sporting games and PE class that for me, it felt like every single time one of those words was used, and we know the words that I'm talking about, but every single time one of those words was used, I felt like it was a direct attack against me. And look, probably 80% of the time it wasn't. But it didn't matter because those words were still being used and the damage had already been done. And the damage had been done so much and nobody was pulling anybody up on it, which was the even worse thing, is if somebody is making homophobic comments in the other kind of areas of schooling that I was in, they were pulled up on it. They were given a detention. They were given a suspension. They were told to fix their language. In sport and PE class, we didn't have that. I felt like there was nobody who was there. The teachers who were running the sporting class, they weren't pulling anybody up on their language usage either. And most of the time they were using it too. So it was the one community that I just could not feel engaged in and I could not be myself. I remember being so awfully scared of being involved in any of the sport or physical activity units at school. And really, I just left altogether because for me that was the easiest option because I did not want to go through that discrimination again.
Yeah, and it sounds like that discrimination was really normalised as part of the sporting and PE environment.
It really was. And it's not just my story. It wasn't just my story too. It's the story of thousands of other young people around Australia. It's that they were also getting that same feeling within sport and PE class and nobody was pulling anybody up on their language either.
Yeah. How did this affect your mental health?
When you're getting told something so many times, or when you're hearing something said about you so many times, you start believing it and you start thinking that it's true because that's all you're hearing and that's the only narrative that you're getting. So for me, what it meant was that I left sport and PE. And that sounds kind of, oh, that's not that bad. You left sport and PE. But by leaving sport and PE, I also left almost 4 periods of my schooling a week. So I wasn't being involved in that. I was staying in the library reading books. So yes, I was getting maybe some of my book knowledge up, but I was missing that physical health literacy that's really, really important when you're growing up. And I'm talking between the ages of 16 to 18 that I just had no involvement in sport or physical activity at all because I was scared. That whole environment of sport was a scary place for me. And the notion of being involved in any type of sporting community, be that inside of school or outside, because of what I experienced before, wasn't something that I was comfortable with. So I was missing out on the physical benefits. And then that just caused me to go in a really deep, dark kind of state of mind and letting my anxiety and a little bit of my depression take over in the way that I thought about not just sport, but a lot of extracurricular activities where I could be making friends or could be getting the social engagement so that I wasn't getting.
It sounds like sport is something that you love, so you were also missing out on something that gave your life a lot of meaning and purpose.
Yeah, look, I was. And I didn't know that at the time as well, which was probably something that I found out later on when I got back into sport, when I started playing basketball again, when I started working in the sporting community as well. I'd really realized what I was missing out on. And the thing that I still think to this day is just imagine the friends that I could have made or the communities that I could have built up with. Imagine where I could have been in my sporting career or in my sporting ability if I had stayed there. Look, if I was to do it again, I'm sure I would have done the same thing and I would have left sport because I really could not go through any of that homophobic behavior anymore. And I think for me, it was protecting myself, leaving sport and physical activity altogether. And it's something that I had to do. And I still think today I did.
And did your own experiences of this discrimination, did that lead to you establishing Pride Cup?
The more and more stories that I heard about LGBTI discrimination within sport, the more urged I was to do something about it because nobody was doing anything about it. LGBTI inclusion, as I said, in sport, it really hasn't changed much over the last 10 years, decades since I graduated college. So I really knew that I had to do something about it. And that's when I joined Pride Cup and really tried to make a difference all throughout Australia, especially in those regional and rural communities that never really get the support they need for LGBTI inclusion and diversity within not just their sporting clubs, but also their local communities.
Definitely. And I guess, how does Pride Cup challenge this discrimination and homophobic language?
So Pride Cup runs Pride-themed events throughout community sporting clubs. So what we do is we go really into the heart of communities across Australia, and their heart is the sporting clubs. Yeah, so on a Saturday or Sunday, if you're at a sporting club in a regional or rural community, you'll literally see lines all the way down the hill. You'll see large crowds at the venues. Sporting clubs are really that community focus and that atmosphere of love and acceptance throughout those regional and rural communities that you don't see in metropolitan cities. So we wanted to use what has typically been known as some of the most homophobic and transphobic environments and turn them into the LGBTI community's biggest allies. So we wanted to make sure that sporting clubs and leagues knew about the discrimination that LGBTI people were facing and then in turn do something about it. So to make sure that them as leaders in their community, that they were making a difference for LGBTI people throughout those communities. And instead of just saying, we accept you, they needed to stand up and show their support for the LGBTI community. They needed to wear rainbows, but they also needed to go through a national education program to make sure they understood real life experiences of LGBTI inclusion within sport and what it meant for people when they are included and accepted and how much of a difference that can make.
What kind of attitude shifts have you seen?
Yeah, so look, it is a really slow process. I'm not going to lie. It's a slow process to try and change the fabric of what sport is in Australia. But what we do see is that in the first year of running a Pride Cup within community sporting clubs, for the first ever time, they're learning about LGBTI inclusion and participation within sports. So we're going into those sporting clubs, most of which are between 2 and 3 hours away from a metro centre. And we're talking to them about the lived experiences of LGBTI people within their communities and throughout all of Australia, and talking to them about the struggles that we face being LGBTI members, and then talking to them about the intersectionality of sport on that and how those struggles become more and more severe the further and deeper into sport that you get. So we are trying to teach them and give them empathy around LGBTI communities to make sure that they can understand what's needed throughout their sporting clubs, but also throughout their regional and rural towns to make sure they can be as inclusive as possible for LGBTI communities.
Yeah, definitely. And I think planting those seeds and those first learning opportunities is such an important role. And change is slow, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible or that it's not happening.
Exactly. Well, look, we're trying to create cultural change. We're not trying to create one-off changes. Yes, the clubs are running an event, which is the Pride Cup itself, but in association with that, they're running a national education program that's evaluated through some of our largest universities in Australia to make sure that what we're seeing is a longitudinal change that can happen throughout their community and throughout their sporting club, and then that can ripple throughout their regional and rural towns as well. Because what we want is Joe or Mary at the local club, we want them to learn about what's happening in LGBTI inclusion, to know about the statistics, to hear about language usage, to know what they can do differently, and then bring it through to their town, bring it through to their workplace, bring it through to their committees and their clubs and their management as well, to make sure that what we see them learning and understanding, they're also sharing with the rest of the community.
It's definitely you'd see that change happen. Have you been back to visit any of the communities where Pride Cup has run events and seen that change in action?
Yeah, we're really lucky we've run games, so we've run Pride Cups with 275 clubs across Australia. And of those 275 clubs, around 90% of them come back for the next year as well. So we now have clubs that are in their 8th year of running a Pride Cup activation.
Wow.
Which is ridiculous because you can see the changes that happen. One of the best kind of experiences that we had around this was when we went through the national plebiscite and got to see the difference between the yes votes of those communities who had run Pride Cups and those communities who had not. And even though there was a community barrier of maybe 10 or 20 kilometres, it wasn't much, we saw such a difference between the likelihood of a yes vote compared to that of a no vote within those communities. And look, it didn't all have to do with Pride Cup, but it definitely did when speaking anecdotally to people in that area. They said that by having that knowledge, that understanding of LGBTI communities, by inviting them into their local community clubs, to their sporting associations, and by running a Pride Cup, really shifted their attitudes towards LGBTI inclusion. And we were able to see that happen kind of through a national vote that should have never happened, but it did.
Yeah.
And we were able to see that change kind of in front of our eyes. And still today, with clubs coming back for their 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th years, and as I said, some in their 8th years, you do see that change happen every year and continue to grow. We're now seeing clubs that in the first year we were talking to some of their under 18s players, and now we're talking to them at 27 years old, and they're talking to us about the experience of being involved in 8 different Pride Cups, how they've talked to all their community, what their family thinks about them being involved, and how they come back each and every year just to play in the Pride Cup. Because they see it as such a positive experience for them to be involved in.
That's such an amazing thing that you've seen and such amazing changes that you've seen.
Yeah, it is great. As I said, we're seeing more clubs sign up every year. So we still do see most of our first year clubs, which is really exciting to see because the enthusiasm that they bring on board is so great because we do know that, well, we do hope that 8 years or 10 years from now, they're still running these events. And the difference then is that it's not about kind of showing that they're visible allies. It's showing that they have LGBTI people as part of their club, be that volunteers or members or players who are playing on the field, and they're able to celebrate them and being involved in their Pride Cup.
And I guess before we finish up, I was wondering, like, what's the effect of like a prominent sports person like Israel Folau making like homophobic comments, and how has Pride Cup sort of answered back to those attitudes and comments?
Do you want my real answer?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go for it. Let's get in trouble.
Yeah.
So I think there's 2 parts of this. There's the effect that people like Israel Folau and their comments can have on the LGBTI community, and then there's the effect of what we've seen recently with NFL players coming out of the closet for the first time, the first active NFL player ever coming out in the US as being openly gay. I think that sport's been around for hundreds of years, and we're just seeing our first active player come out as gay.
Exactly.
So you look at it, when we look at that first step, kind of the Israel Folaus of the world and the effect that has, the effect that it has mostly is on the mental health and well-being of young people. What we're talking about there isn't about the right for free speech of Israel Folau. What we need to be talking about and focusing on is the mental health aspect that could have on LGBTI, young people especially, around Australia. So the comments that he made and the fact that they're still up there on social media is indicative of how backwards our sporting communities are in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And what that's happening is, what we know is around 1 in 2 trans kids by the time that they hit 18 have attempted suicide.
Jesus.
When they're accepted or included, we know that figure goes down to the same as their cis or hetero peers. So when you're looking at it that way, all you've got to do is accept somebody for who they are in order to save their lives and to help save their lives. And by making comments like what he did, does the exact opposite of that. It shows people that they're not included and accepted, and it gets almost a cult following of people who are using religion as a tool or saying that it's free speech, but it's not. It's really, really harmful for the mental health and well-being of young people all throughout Australia.
Yeah, there's a huge difference between free speech and hate speech.
Honestly, by saying those comments and by using free speech as a tool to try and get away with it, you are seeing that it is so severely damaging for young LGBTI people across Australia. And then the more and more people who reciprocate, who like those comments, who start saying things of their own and thinking they can get away with it because they've seen somebody on such a high level get away with it, then it just causes a ripple effect that we don't want to see happen throughout our communities, where we're trying to break down that stigma and make sure LGBTI people can be involved in sport and physical activity. But why would you get involved when you're seeing these comments almost be, they're not reprimanded and they're almost applauded?
Yeah, and like teams like the Dragons were courting Israel Folau earlier this year to play for them in spite of his comments.
Exactly right. And they always put it against politics and say politics has no place in our sport. But this has nothing to do with politics. LGBTI inclusion is about saving lives. And it's about getting people fit, healthy, worrying about their mental health and well-being, but as well as worrying about their physical health and well-being, letting them be social with their friends and counterparts who are playing sport and being involved in those communities that they wouldn't be otherwise.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Well, thank you so much, James. I really, really appreciate the time that you've taken to chat with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for what you're doing as well.
Thank you for tuning in to It's a Minefield. This program has been kindly funded by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales and broadcast on community radio station 2RRR in Sydney. Produced by Leon Fernandez,
Caroline Savransky,
Chris Jager, with executive producer Jeff Furlow. You can reach out to us on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's a Minefield, or get in touch via email info@iamf.org.au. See you on the flip side, June bugs.